Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint watercolor snowdrops. Snowdrops are a January birth month flower, and because they're white, they can be kind of tricky to paint in watercolor, so let's talk about it. Today I'm using my limited palette of colors. It has cad yellow, magenta, cerulean, indigo, and sap green on this palette. I had both of these round brushes here, but I only ended up using my size 4 round brush for this entire painting. First, we're going to paint the greenery. I am mixing cad yellow with sap green to get a nice bright yellow-green color, and the consistency is about an even paint to water ratio. I like to start with the stems and the leaves because sometimes when I start with the flowers, I don't actually make enough room for the stems and the leaves. So we're going to start with the first stem. Snowdrop stems have a nice long curved hook at the very end. And then we're going to place the leaves using the body of the brush to push down and create this leaf shape. Now, snowdrops are found in bunches together, so I'm going to put down a lot of leaves at the base of this one stem, and then we'll put all of the other stems of the flowers that we're creating for this bunch into those leaves. I find this to be the easiest way to not lose the space that I want to create the leaves. Sometimes we put all of our stems down and then it's really hard to fit the leaves in. But if we put all of the leaves in first, especially in a grouping like this, then we can put the stems kind of wherever, either on top of the leaves or peeking through. I just find it to be a little bit easier this way to make sure all of my leaves actually are there. So now I've added 2 more curved stems, and I wanted them to be at different heights and to have balance between one curving to the right and then a couple curving to the left and keeping it in the rule of 3s, and then adding some more leaves to kind of finish off this little grouping. And you can see that when I'm adding the leaves, I'm using very light pressure with the tip of my brush. This is the long round 4, and then I'm pushing down on the body of my brush and then creating the leaf shape that I want. So make sure that you have some movement in your leaves to make it look really organic and fun. Having movement in your leaves is a great way to make stagnant flowers feel really interesting. Now I've picked up some sap green. It's a little bit higher concentration, you can tell because it's a lot darker, and I'm just adding it lightly into some shadowy areas, especially under those little curved leaves that I did. It makes it look like the tip of the leaf is curving over just by adding a little bit of shadow underneath that curve that we created. And then you can add a little bit of shadow here and there just on the leaves to define some of the highlights, to define maybe leaves that are in the back. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be a reason. You can just add this color as a beautiful layer to give lots of texture and interest to the leaves, and not necessarily just to be for shadow. We're going to let the greenery dry and focus on painting the flowers. Painting white flowers actually means you're painting the color that's reflected on the white. And so we're mixing together some light blues, a little bit of green, a tiny bit of magenta, because we want a shadowy color that has a little bit more blue reflected in it, but it needs to be dull, like almost a gray. So I like to grab a scratch piece of paper to test my colors on, to test their strength, to test their color tone, add a little bit more green if it's too pink, add a little bit more yellow if it's too purple, and I really want to also test the strength if it needs to be more watered down, because we don't want our flowers to look gray, like we painted a gray flower. We want it to be very light, like we are painting the undertones of a white flower. So here's my trick with painting snowdrops. I like to paint the circular bulbous part that's at the top of the petals in a very strong green consistency. Not too watery, but not so thick that paint can't move it around. Then I rinse it off completely, and then I pick up my grayish purple color and I tap that color into the green as I paint the petal. This makes a really nice blend, which gives more color to the white flower. You get just a tiny bit of green blended into the petal. So Snowdrops have 3 petals only, so don't get carried away with the number of petals. And also, you want to think about how the petals look from the front. You don't want 3 perfect petals viewed exactly from the front because they're not going to be all perfectly in view. You want maybe one center petal that is perfectly shaped that you can see exactly as it is, and then one that's maybe hiding, and then one that is a little bit thinner because you're seeing it from the side. So look at reference pictures and see how snowdrops are shaped, because you don't want all of the petals perfectly even exactly in a row. You're going to want to adjust how they are viewed depending on the direction you want to paint it. And then we repeat that same process for the other flowers, adding the little bit of greenery at the top, rinsing our brush, grabbing our light grayish purple flower petal color, and then tapping that color into the green as we shape our petals. So try to make all of your petals and all of your flowers a little bit different. For this one, I wanted 2 flower petals that we can kind of mostly see. They're a little bit smaller than if it was a main front and center petal. And then I wanted a petal that was kind of peeking between them in the back. As long as your flower petals are still wet, you can manipulate them and change the shape and the size. I like to start with my flower petals a little bit smaller than I think I want them, and then I can adjust the size a little bit easier, just kind of on the edges, and shape them how I want before they dry. Snowdrops do have a center petal that has a very tiny green tip, so don't worry too much about your flower petals meeting and there not being enough separation. We're going to put a little bit of green between these flowers to represent that petal with the green tip that's in the center. So just know that that's coming. It's not very clear in the reference picture, but if you look up reference photos, there are lots of pictures that show that little bit of green, which I think is such a lovely touch right in the middle of the flower. So we'll add that later. Again, on this lower flower, we are adding that green part at the top and then adding our petals. And you'll see me thinking a lot in this painting with my brush. It kind of dances around as I'm trying to figure out how I want the petals to look and how I want to make each flower a little bit different than the next one. So there's definitely a lot of pauses that I end up cutting out because I just kind of float my brush around the paper as I'm trying to think about the best place to put things. So if that's you, that's totally normal. You might have noticed that after I place the petals, I tap on that junction between the green and the flower petals just a little bit. I'm wetting my brush, and with a damp brush, I'm trying to encourage some of that green to float into the petals a little bit more. I really like the subtle green blend into the flower petals, especially since we're painting white. It just really helps to define more color into our petals without painting them a color. If you see on our reference photo, there's kind of this little leaf thing that acts almost like a little umbrella on the stem and curves over the top of the hook and the flower. So I am taking some more sap green and I'm adding that with the shape of my brush just over the top of each of these flowers. I added it later because I really wanted to get the perspective of everything all together and add that as a final touch with some more of my darker sap green indigo mixtures. Because I'm using a round size 4, it's kind of a thin brush, so I'm able to use just the size of my brush to push down to create that shape. Just make sure that if you are using a larger brush, you're not pushing down as heavy to make a thinner leaf shape. This is the point in the painting where we're adding all of the final details, so it's usually the heaviest in contrast and the thickest in consistency of paint. I like to add indigo to my sap green for this final layer of contrast, and remember that a little bit goes a long way. I'm not trying to overwhelm the leaves, I'm just trying to add the final layer. So I always say light, medium, and dark values. Once you have all 3, you know you're done. So the lightest value usually takes up the bulk of the painting, with the medium values adding a lot of the depth and perspective, and then the contrast really finishes everything off with that final detail and rounds everything out making the lighter areas appear even brighter because of the difference between the two values. So we need all three levels, we need all three layers, and I usually do this last darker value in a higher concentration of pigment, and again, just a tiny bit here and there to really make our medium and light values pop the most. Now we're finished with the greenery, we are going to focus on the final details of the flowers to really make them stand out so they don't look quite as flat. We talked about this earlier, but in some reference photos, I saw there was this really bright green tip on a middle petal inside the flower. So I am using some of my yellow, mixing it with the sap green to create this really bright pop of green right in the center between some of the petals. You don't want it between all of the petals, especially if you have some that are pretty open and wide. Just pick one side where that petal would most likely be peeking through and just place it between those petals and then leave it just nice and simple. Don't go overboard. It's just a simple bit of green inside the flower. Now with a very damp brush, I'm just going to pick up that purpley gray color we've been using to add to our flower petals for just a tiny bit of shadow and contrast. Again, don't overdo it. Just think about where there might be a little bit of shadow and just do a quick swipe. Remember, we don't want the flower petals to look gray because it's not a gray flower. We want them to look like they are reflecting the light around them. So just keep those contrasting shadows really simple and really light. I added a little bit of dark green to the inside of the flowers to finish it off, and then we're going to add the word January to the top of the paper because it is one of the January birth month flowers, along with carnations that we painted just the other day, and I will link that video in the description below. Let me know what you think of these snowdrops. I hope you try this out and that you found the instruction valuable, especially as it relates to white flowers. I'll see you all in my next video.